They planned the perfect battle. 6 months of flawless victories had proven their carriers invincible, their pilots untouchable, their strategy unbreakable. Yet on June 4th, 1942, between dawn and dusk, 4 Japanese fleet carriers vanished beneath the Pacific, taking with them not just steel and aircraft, but the entire momentum of Japan's war. The architects of Pearl Harbor became the victims of Midway. Before we go deeper into how this decision changed the Pacific War forever, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. The morning of December 7th, 1941, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers materialized from the northern Pacific like ghosts made of steel. Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo commanded them from the bridge of Akagi, the flagship whose name meant Red Castle. The Kido Butai, the first air fleet, represented the most concentrated carrier striking force ever assembled. Akagi and Kaga, converted from battleship and battlecruiser hulls respectively, displaced over 36,000 tons each. Akagi measured 855 feet from stem to stern, longer than 2 football fields laid end to end. Her single-flight deck stretched 817 feet, wide enough to operate aircraft in near-simultaneous launches. Below deck, 2 aircraft hangars could accommodate 66 aircraft total, zeros cates, and valves packed so tightly that wings nearly touched. Kaga, even larger at 715 feet long with a beam of 106 feet, could embark 90 aircraft across her expansive hangar spaces. Both ships, though converted from capital ship hulls designed for armor and guns, had been transformed into platforms optimized for projecting air power across hundreds of miles of ocean. Soryu and Hiryu, purpose-built fleet carriers of the more modern design, were sleeker and faster. Soryu displaced 15,900 tons standard, less than half Akagi's displacement, yet her purpose-built hull achieved 34.5 knots maximum speed, fast enough to keep pace with cruisers and flee from battleships. Her narrow beam of 70 feet and length of 746 feet gave her the profile of a racing yacht compared to the lumbering converted capital ships. Hiryu, slightly larger at 17,300 tons, shared Soryu's speed and agility while carrying 64 aircraft. Both ships represented Japan's second-generation carrier design philosophy: speed, maneuverability, and operational range prioritized over armor protection and magazine capacity. Together with the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, the newest and most capable ships in the IJN's carrier force, they carried 414 aircraft and the world's most experienced naval aviators into Hawaiian waters. This was not merely a task force. It was the concentrated expression of a doctrine that had consumed Japan's naval thinking for 2 decades. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda led the first wave over Pearl Harbor at 0749 hours. His radio man transmitted, "Tora! Tora! Tora!" the code confirming tactical surprise achieved. The message rippled back to Akagi, where Admiral Nagumo received confirmation that 6 months of training, planning, and steaming through winter storms had delivered exactly what the operation promised: complete surprise against an unprepared enemy. Fukuda's formation: 183 aircraft, including 43 Zeros, 49 high-level bombers, 51 dive bombers, and 40 torpedo bombers, descended on Battleship Row with precision that only endless training could produce. The Kates, carrying Type 91 aerial torpedoes, came in low across the harbor, their pilots maintaining 50-foot altitude while maneuvering between hangars and fuel tanks. Each torpedo, released at precisely 500 yards from target, entered the water, stabilized at 40-foot depth, then ran at 41 knots toward the battleship's vulnerable underwater holes. The Type 91's design, specifically modified for Pearl Harbor's shallow 45-foot harbor depth, performed exactly as tested. Torpedoes struck USS West Virginia, USS Oklahoma, USS California, USS Nevada. Simultaneously, high-level bombers approached from altitude, releasing 800-kilogram armor-piercing bombs converted from 16-inch naval shells. These projectiles, designed to penetrate battleship deck armor, punched through USS Arizona's forward magazine. The explosion consumed 1,177 men in seconds. Dive bombers targeted airfields, hangars, and ships in dry dock. Within 2 hours, The Kido Butai's aircraft had sunk or damaged 8 battleships, destroyed 188 American aircraft, and killed 2,403 servicemen. The Japanese lost 29 aircraft, a 14-to-1 kill ratio that validated every assumption about carrier aviation's dominance. By any measure of military efficiency, Pearl Harbor represented carrier aviation's definitive validation. The battle demonstrated that carrier-based aircraft could achieve what battleships never could: strategic surprise, concentrated striking power, and decisive results delivered faster than the enemy could react. But the battle also revealed something more subtle, something the Japanese high command chose not to see. 3 American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were absent from Pearl Harbor that morning. Enterprise was returning from Wake Island. Lexington was approaching Midway. Saratoga was in San Diego. They remained operational, untouched, waiting. Japanese planning had identified American carriers as the primary threat. Yet when presented with an opportunity to search for and sink them, Nagumo declined. The battleships were enough. The doctrine declared victory. The carriers escaped. The Imperial Japanese Navy's faith in carrier aviation did not emerge suddenly. It evolved from a doctrine called Kantai-Kessen, the decisive battle strategy. This concept, derived from Alfred Thayer Mahan's writings on sea power, envisioned war as a single climactic fleet engagement that would destroy the enemy's will to fight. The IJN had studied Mahan's analysis of Admiral Togo's victory over the Russian Baltic Fleet at Tsushima in 1905. That battle annihilated Russia's naval power in one afternoon, forcing a peace treaty favorable to Japan. For the next 36 years, Japanese naval strategy orbited around replicating Tsushima's decisive result. Yet by the 1930s, the nature of decisive battle had changed. Battleships still formed the IJN's psychological core, but carrier aircraft extended striking range from 12 miles, a battleship's maximum gun range, to over 200 miles. The A-6M Fighter, entering service in 1940, possessed a combat radius exceeding 300 miles with drop tanks. The Nakajima B-5 Enkate torpedo bomber could carry the Type 91 aerial torpedo 250 miles to its target. The Aichi D-3A Val dive bomber, with its fixed landing gear and elliptical wings, could deliver an 550-pound bomb with accuracy that battleship guns could never match. These aircraft transformed carriers into the decisive element that battleships had once represented. Training doctrine reinforced this transformation with a rigor that bordered on ruthless. Japanese carrier pilots underwent a selection and training process more rigorous than any other nation's, and paid for that rigor with time Japan could not afford. Candidates began with 300 hours of basic flight training spread across 12 months. They learned to handle the sensitive controls of primary trainers like the Yokosuka K5Y, an aircraft deliberately designed to punish pilot error. Poor coordination during takeoff resulted in ground loops. Insufficient back pressure during landing produced bounces that shattered landing gear. Early solo flights killed roughly 1 in 20 trainees. Those who survived progressed to advanced training on aircraft that more closely replicated operational types, machines with more power, less stability, and handling characteristics that demanded constant pilot attention. Then came specialized carrier operations. Landing on a carrier deck, a platform moving at 30 knots, pitching in ocean swells, offering a target area smaller than a football field that might rise 8 feet or drop 12 feet between 1 second and the next, required precision that eliminated marginal pilots without mercy. The landing signal officer stood on a platform at the carrier's stern, holding colored paddles to guide approaching aircraft. Pilots had to maintain exact airspeed, exact altitude, exact angle of approach while watching the LSO signals and simultaneously monitoring the deck's motion. Too fast meant a barrier crash. Too slow meant a stall and ditching. Correct speed, but wrong angle meant missing the arresting wires and careening into aircraft parked forward. Training killed pilots regularly. Carriers kept lifeboats ready and destroyer escorts stationed astern to recover survivors or bodies. Those who survived carrier qualification moved to tactical training that consumed another 18 months. Fighter pilots practiced air combat maneuvers against opponents flying identical aircraft, learning to exploit the Zero's advantages while understanding its weaknesses. They mastered deflection shooting, vertical maneuvering, and the tactics required to destroy bombers without being destroyed by defensive fire. Dive bomber pilots learned to enter their attack from 12,000 feet, rolling inverted to spot the target, then rolling upright into an 80-degree dive that turned the ocean vertical and the target horizontal in their sight. They released at 1,500 feet, low enough for accuracy, but high enough to avoid blast effects, and pulled out at 500 feet above the water, pulling 6 G-forces that grayed vision and crushed breath. Torpedo bomber pilots mastered the Kate's complex attack profile, approaching at 150 knots, fast enough to minimize exposure time, but slow enough to maintain torpedo stability, descending to 50 feet above the waves where one mistake meant a splash and death, releasing at 500 yards from the target, then banking hard to avoid anti-aircraft fire while maintaining enough airspeed to climb out of the killing zone. Every maneuver was practiced until muscle memory eliminated conscious thought. By the time a Japanese naval aviator reached operational status, he had typically accumulated 700 hours of flight time and 3 years of training. He was extraordinarily skilled. He was also nearly impossible to replace. This training produced aviators of extraordinary skill, but it produced them slowly and in numbers that appeared adequate in peacetime, but proved catastrophically insufficient in war. By December 1941, the IJN possessed approximately 3,500 train carrier pilots, a number that took 5 years to achieve and represented the entire output of Japan's pilot training establishment operating at maximum peacetime capacity. The mathematics were brutal. Each carrier air group required approximately 120 pilots for its assigned aircraft, plus another 20% for rotation, illness, and administrative duties. Maintaining 6 fleet carriers in operation demanded 720 pilots, 20% of the IJN's entire trained pilot corps. Combat attrition, training accidents, disease, and operational losses consumed pilots at rates the training system never anticipated. Replacing a dead fighter pilot required 3 years. The training tempo could not match combat attrition. Each pilot killed represented an irreplaceable asset, a fact that would haunt Japanese carrier operations throughout the war. Yet in December 1941, with victory following victory, this vulnerability remained theoretical. The pilots seemed invincible. Their skill seemed sufficient. The future seemed to promise only continued success. The Kido Butai's coordination elevated carrier warfare beyond individual ship operations. American and British carriers typically operated independently or in pairs. The Japanese concentrated their carriers into a single striking force, massing their air groups for overwhelming power. At Pearl Harbor, coordinating attacks from 6 carriers required precise timing. Aircraft from different ships had to form up, maintain radio silence, navigate 230 miles to target, execute strikes against specific objectives, and return in sequence to their respective carriers. The Kido Butai executed this ballet without significant error. After Pearl Harbor, the first air fleet swept through the Pacific like a typhoon moving across empty ocean, destroying everything in its path, and seemingly unstoppable. On January 20th, 1942, they struck Rabaul in New Britain. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Shokaku, Zuikaku, launched 105 aircraft against the Australian and American forces defending the harbor. The attack destroyed 12 aircraft on the ground and sank 3 ships. More importantly, it secured Rabaul as a forward base for operations in the South Pacific. The Kido Butai operated with impunity, appearing wherever IJN's strategy required overwhelming air power, then vanishing into the Pacific's immensity before Allied forces could respond. February brought raids against Darwin, Australia, a target 2,000 miles from the nearest Japanese base, but within easy striking range of carrier-based aircraft. On February 19th, Nagumo launched 188 aircraft from 4 carriers positioned in the Timor Sea. The raid destroyed 23 aircraft on the ground, damaged 8 more beyond repair, sank 8 ships in the harbor, including the destroyer USS Peary, and killed 243 people. The attack demonstrated that no Allied port in the Southwest Pacific was beyond Japanese reach. Darwin burned for hours, its harbor choked with wreckage, its defenses shattered. The Kido Butai retired untouched. In April, Nagumo took 5 carriers into the Indian Ocean, an operation so audacious that the British Eastern Fleet withdrew to East Africa rather than face battle. The Japanese carriers struck Ceylon on April 5th and 9th, sinking the British carrier Hermes, 2 heavy cruisers, and 23 merchant ships. The raids drove the Royal Navy from the eastern Indian Ocean, securing Japan's western flank and cutting the sea link between India and Australia. By May 1942, Japanese forces controlled an empire stretching from the Indian Ocean to the Central Pacific, from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands, an area encompassing 1/7 of the Earth's surface. The conquest had taken 5 months. Not a single Japanese carrier had been sunk. The Kido Butai appeared invincible, its doctrine validated by victory after victory, its vulnerabilities hidden beneath the success that masked every structural weakness. Victory cultivated a dangerous assumption that Japanese carrier doctrine was not merely effective but invincible. The victories at Pearl Harbor, Darwin, and Ceylon became proof that concentrated carrier strikes, executed by elite pilots flying superior aircraft, could not be defeated. This assumption shaped the planning for Operation MI, the invasion of Midway Atoll. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, conceived Operation MI as a trap, the decisive battle that Japanese doctrine demanded and American industrial capacity required. The battle plan recognized strategic realities that Japan's run of victories had not changed. America's industrial capacity would eventually overwhelm Japan unless decisive victory came quickly. The numbers were undeniable and terrifying. American shipyards could build carriers faster than Japan could train pilots to fly from them. American factories produced aircraft by the thousands, while Japan struggled to manufacture hundreds. American petroleum reserves dwarfed Japan's captured oil fields. Given time, America would construct a fleet so massive that Japanese defensive perimeters would collapse under sheer weight of material. Yamamoto needed to destroy the American carrier force that had escaped Pearl Harbor before that industrial tsunami gathered momentum. Capturing Midway, a tiny atoll 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii, comprising 2 small islands and a lagoon barely 2 miles across, would threaten the Hawaiian Islands directly. The atoll's airfield could base patrol aircraft that would extend Japanese reconnaissance coverage hundreds of miles east. Heavy bombers based at Midway could strike Pearl Harbor, reversing the strategic situation that Yamamoto faced. More importantly, Midway's capture would represent a dagger aimed at Hawaii itself, an intolerable threat that would force American response. The Americans, Yamamoto calculated, would commit their remaining carriers to defend Midway. The Kido Butai would destroy those carriers in the kind of decisive engagement that had annihilated the Russian fleet at Tsushima, that had validated Japanese naval doctrine, that would force America to negotiate peace from a position of weakness. The plan possessed elegant logic. It assumed American response would be predictable. It assumed Japanese carriers would achieve surprise. It assumed that complexity could be managed through rigorous planning. Every assumption proved wrong. The plan's architecture reflected the decisive battle doctrine carried to its logical extreme. Yamamoto divided the combined fleet into 7 separate groups spread across thousands of miles of ocean. The northern force would attack the Aleutian Islands as a diversion. The invasion force would transport 5,000 troops to capture Midway. The main body, including the battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built, would follow 300 miles behind the carriers, ready to annihilate any American ships that survived the air battle. The Kido Butai, reduced to 4 carriers after Coral Sea damaged Shokaku and depleted Zuikika's air group, would strike Midway's defenses, then pivot to destroy the American carriers when they appeared. Admiral Nagumo commanded the Kido Butai from Akagi's Bridge as his force sortied from Japan on May 27th. Akagi displaced 41,300 tons at full load, stretched 855 feet in length, and carried 66 aircraft. Her island structure rose on the port side rather than the standard starboard position, unique configuration among Japanese carriers. Kaga, converted from a Tosa-class battleship hull, displaced 43,650 tons and operated 90 aircraft from her single-flight deck. Soryu, launched in 1935, represented a more refined design. 746 feet long, 28.5 knots maximum speed, and 71 aircraft capacity. Her sister ship, Hiryu, carried 64 aircraft and featured an island mounted on the port side, matching Akagi's configuration for tactical flexibility. These four carriers embarked 248 aircraft. The air group composition reflected Japanese offensive doctrine. 84 Zeros for air superiority, 84 Vals for precision bombing, and 80 Kates, configured for either torpedo or level bombing attacks. The pilots represented the cream of Japanese naval aviation. Many had flown at Pearl Harbor. All possessed at least 2 years of carrier experience. Their aircraft, though not perfect, remained formidable. The Zero's 14-cylinder Nakajima NK 1C Sakai radial engine produced 940 horsepower, driving the fighter to 316 miles per hour while maintaining a combat radius of 1,160 miles. The Kate's top speed of 235 miles per hour seemed pedestrian, but the aircraft could carry a 1,764-pound Type 91 torpedo or an 800-kilogram bomb. The Val, despite its fixed landing gear, excelled at precision dive bombing. Its pilots routinely placed bombs within 30 feet of their aim point. Yet Operation MI contained flaws that 6 months of victory had obscured. The plan's complexity violated a fundamental military principle: that success depends on simplicity. Coordinating 7 separate task groups required precise timing and constant communication, yet Yamamoto imposed strict radio silence to maintain surprise. The main body's battleships, positioned 300 miles behind the carriers, could not support the Kido Butai if American carriers appeared unexpectedly. Most critically, the plan assigned Nagumo contradictory objectives: suppress Midway's defenses for the invasion force, maintain a reserve strike for American carriers, and support the occupation once the island fell. These missions required different aircraft loadouts and tactics. Nagumo could not execute all 3 simultaneously. American codebreakers shattered the plan's first assumption: strategic surprise. Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, led by Commander Joseph Rockefort, had partially penetrated the Japanese JN-25 naval code. By May 1942, Rockefort's team detected references to AF as Operation MI's target. Rockefort suspected AF designated Midway, but he needed confirmation. He ordered Midway to transmit an uncoded message reporting the island's water distillation plant had broken down. 2 days later, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese message reporting that AF was experiencing freshwater problems. The trap was revealed before it could be set. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, committed his available carriers to ambush Nagumo. Enterprise and Hornet would form Task Force 16 under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. Yorktown, hastily repaired from damage sustained at Coral Sea, would sail as Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher. The Americans would position northeast of Midway, unknown to the Japanese, and strike the Kido Butai when it committed to attacking the island. For once, American carriers would achieve the tactical surprise that Japanese doctrine assumed belonged exclusively to Japan. June 3rd passed in approaching movements. The Kido Butai steamed southeast at 24 knots, the 4 carriers arrayed in a box formation with 2 miles separating each ship. Screening them were 2 fast battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, a surface force, capable of destroying anything that reached close range. At 0430 on June 4th, while darkness still covered the Pacific, Nagumo launched the Midway strike. Lieutenant Joichi Tamanaga led the formation from the cockpit of a Kate bomber. Tomonaga was Hiryu's senior aviator, temporarily replacing Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, who lay in Akagi's sickbay recovering from an appendectomy. The strike group comprised 108 aircraft, 36 Vals, 36 Kates armed with 800-kilogram bombs, and 36 Zeros. The formation took 30 minutes to assemble in the pre-dawn darkness, then set course for Midway, 240 miles southeast. Behind them, on the four carriers, an identical-sized strike force remained spotted on deck, aircraft armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for use against ships. These 108 aircraft represented Nagumo's reserve, the force that would annihilate American carriers when they inevitably appeared. The Japanese plan assumed those carriers would sortie from Pearl Harbor once Midway reported the attack, a transit requiring 30 hours. Therefore, the Americans could not arrive before June 5th at the earliest. Nagumo's reserve strike would remain ready, but not launched until enemy carriers were located. The logic seemed flawless. The First Air Fleet had operated on this principle for 6 months without error. There was no reason to expect June 4th would differ. At 0520, while Tomonaga's formation flew toward Midway, 7 American search planes lifted from the atoll. At 0534, a PBY Catalina flying boat spotted the Kido Butai and transmitted a contact report. At 0555, Midway's radar detected Tomonaga's incoming strike at 93 miles distance. Every operational aircraft on Midway scrambled. Marine fighters climbed to intercept. Army, Navy, and Marine bombers launched to attack the Japanese carriers. By 0600, as Tomonaga's formation reached Midway, the island was ready. More significantly, Midway had transmitted the Kido Butai's position to the American carriers 200 miles northeast. The battle for Midway Island lasted 30 minutes. Japanese Zeros shredded the Marine fighters. 21 of 26 Brewster Buffaloes and Grumman Wildcats were shot down or damaged beyond repair. But the fighters had disrupted the bomber formations. Anti-aircraft fire, heavier than intelligence predicted, damaged multiple Vals and Kates. Tomonaga's aircraft struck fuel tanks, destroyed buildings, and cratered the runway. But they did not suppress Midway's defenses. At 0700, as his formation retired toward the carriers, Tomonaga transmitted a message that would alter everything. There is need for a second attack wave. Nagumo received Tomonaga's assessment at 0705. Simultaneously, American aircraft from Midway began attacking the Kido Butai. Army B-26 Marauders and Navy TBF Avengers came in low, attempting torpedo runs. Marine SBD, Dauntless Dove from altitude. Army B-17 Flying Fortresses released bombs from 20,000 feet. The attacks, though brave, achieved nothing. Zeros swarmed the attackers. Ship maneuvers and anti-aircraft fire disrupted bombing runs. By 0830, the Midway-based attacks had ended without a single hit on any Japanese ship, but they had consumed 90 critical minutes. During those minutes, Nagumo faced the decision that would define the battle. Tomonaga reported Midway required a second strike, but launching that strike meant rearming the reserve aircraft, swapping torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for land attack weapons. If American carriers appeared while the reserve was rearmed, the Kido Butai would be vulnerable. Yet, no American carriers had been spotted. At 0715, Nagumo ordered the rearming. Ordnance men swarmed onto the hangar decks. Hydraulic carts lowered torpedoes from Kates. Type 91 torpedoes, each weighing 1,840 pounds, were rolled to the elevators and struck below. In their place, 800-kilogram land bombs were hoisted and attached to fuselage hardpoints. The process required an hour under optimal conditions. At 0728, a message arrived from the Cruiser Tone's reconnaissance aircraft. The radio operator aboard Akagi transcribed the message and rushed it to the bridge. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships in position bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway, course 150 degrees, speed over 20 knots. Nagumo read the message. He read it again. 10 ships. Enemy ships. But no mention of carriers. The formation's course, southeast, away from Midway, and speed, over 20 knots, suggested cruisers and destroyers, possibly supporting a patrol line or conducting a sweep. Significant, certainly. A surface force of that size could threaten the Midway invasion convoy, but not the decisive threat that carriers represented. Not the target that Operation MI was designed to destroy. The message contained an unstated problem that Nagumo's staff immediately recognized. Tone Scout had launched 30 minutes late due to catapult malfunction. Had the aircraft launched on schedule, it would have reached this search sector at 0700. It would have spotted the American ships earlier. The half-hour delay might have allowed American carriers to move within striking range without being detected. Or perhaps there were no carriers. Perhaps this was merely a cruiser force that had sortied from Pearl Harbor to harass the Midway invasion. Uncertainty plagued every calculation. At 0745, Nagumo signaled the tone search plane, ascertain ship types, and maintain contact. The order was necessary, but highlighted the intelligence gap that doctrine never anticipated. Japanese planning assumed that reconnaissance would provide complete information before battle commenced. Reality provided ambiguous contact reports from aircraft with limited endurance flying assigned search patterns. 15 minutes passed. Each minute felt stretched, elongated by the weight of decision delayed. Tone's aircraft maneuvered for a better view, closing the distance to the American formation while trying to avoid detection by what might be enemy fighters. On the 4, carriers, rearming continued. Torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs accumulated in the hangar decks rather than being struck into secure magazines, a calculated risk to save time, a decision that prioritized speed of rearming over protection against damage. Ordnance men wheeled the heavy torpedoes across the hangar deck, their metal transport carts clanging on steel flooring. Type 91 torpedoes, each containing 452 pounds of Type 97 explosive, lay unsecured in racks. Bombs stacked in corners awaited transport back to the magazines. The hangar deck resembled a munitions depot more than a warship's interior. Fire was the nightmare scenario. Fire among fuel-laden aircraft, fire near unsecured ordnance, fire in the confined space of a hangar where damage control faced overwhelming odds. At 0800, Tomonaga's Midway strike force began landing. The carriers turned into the wind in sequence, recovering aircraft while maintaining anti-aircraft formation. Each landing evolution required the carrier to steady on course, maintain speed, and provide a stable platform for aircraft with damaged control surfaces, wounded crew, or battle damage that made normal landings impossible. The recovery proceeded smoothly, evidence of training and experience that made complex operations routine. At 0809, just as Nagumo's operations staff began calculating the time required to complete rearming and launch the anti-ship strike, Tone Scout transmitted a second message. The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier bringing up the rear. A carrier. The message transformed everything. Every assumption underlying Nagumo's decisions for the past 90 minutes became suspect. If American carriers were present, they had sortied from Pearl Harbor earlier than Japanese intelligence predicted. If they had sortied early, American intelligence might have advanced knowledge of Operation MI. If American intelligence knew about Operation MI, then surprise was lost. If surprise was lost, the entire operational plan was compromised. And if a carrier was present 240 miles from Midway, it could already have launched a strike. Those aircraft could be inbound at this moment. The WW2 might be under attack within the hour. A carrier, not cruisers, a carrier. The report transformed the tactical situation. Everything Yamamoto had planned now converged on this moment. The American carrier represented both the objective, the target Operation MI was designed to destroy, and the threat, a force capable of striking the WW2 with torpedoes and bombs. Nagumo needed to launch an immediate strike, but half his reserve aircraft were rearmed for land attack. The other half retained their torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. Meanwhile, Tomonaga's aircraft still circled overhead, fuel states declining, waiting to land. Some Kates were damaged and needed immediate recovery, or they would ditch in the ocean, losing pilots Japan could not afford to replace. At 0815, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding Carrier Division 2 from Hiryu, sent an urgent message to Nagumo. Consider it advisable to launch attack force immediately. Yamaguchi was one of the IJN's most aggressive officers. His recommendation was to launch whatever aircraft were ready, even if only half the strike force could be armed properly, even if coordination suffered. Speed mattered more than perfection when American dive bombers might appear overhead at any moment. Nagumo declined. The decision reflected doctrine and experience. Every successful Kido Butai operation had emphasized coordinated mass strikes. Launching a partial attack violated this principle. Nagumo chose to recover Tomonaga's aircraft first, complete rearming, then launch a properly constituted strike with 100-plus aircraft. The logic was sound. It had worked at Pearl Harbor, Darwin, Ceylon. It would work now. At 0818, Nagumo signaled the entire force. After taking aboard attack planes, force will temporarily retire to the north to rearm and refuel planes. Then we will attack enemy carriers. The next 90 minutes became a race between Japanese preparation and American attack, between doctrine and reality, between what training promised and what battle delivered. On the four carriers, organized chaos ruled the flight and hangar decks. Tomonaga's returning aircraft landed in sequence. Damaged planes first, their hydraulics failing or control surfaces shot away, requiring immediate recovery before systems completely failed. Then came those low on fuel, their engines sputtering as tanks ran dry, pilots nursing throttles to keep power plants alive for 30 more seconds until the arresting hook caught a wire. Finally, those still combat-capable, aircraft that could have continued flying but needed rearming and refueling for the next strike. Each landing required 2 minutes from the moment the aircraft entered the landing pattern until it cleared the arresting gear and taxied forward. The carriers turned into the wind for every recovery, then back to base course, then into the wind again, a constant maneuvering that disrupted the screening destroyers' anti-submarine patrols and complicated the battleship's positioning. As aircraft landed, they were struck below to the hangar decks on massive elevators that lowered aircraft from flight deck to hangar in 60 seconds, or positioned forward on the flight deck, wings folded, awaiting the next launch. Simultaneously, reserve aircraft armed with land bombs were rearmed again, this time back to torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for anti-ship work. The rearming process reversed the work of the previous 90 minutes. The ordnance men worked at maximum speed, securing bombs and torpedoes with fabric-covered steel cables, attaching arming wires that would arm the weapons once the aircraft launched, loading ammunition into the Zero's wing-mounted 20mm cannon, 60 rounds per gun, each round capable of shredding an enemy bomber. The tempo was frantic but controlled. These men had practiced rearming countless times during training exercises. They knew the procedures. They knew the risks. What they did not know was that their speed meant nothing. If American dive bombers arrived before completion, at 0920, recovery operations completed. All of Tomonaga's aircraft were aboard. The four carriers increased speed to 30 knots and turned north, opening distance from Midway, while aircraft were being rearmed and refueled. On the flight decks, crews began spotting the strike force, positioning aircraft for launch. The Kates, heaviest and requiring longest takeoff runs, would launch first. Then Vals. Finally Zeros. At 10:20, Nagumo planned to launch. 102 aircraft would attack the American carrier. But at 0920, when recovery completed, American torpedo bombers arrived. 15 Douglas TBD Devastators from Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8 attacked without fighter escort. The obsolete aircraft, capable of only 115 knots with a torpedo slung beneath the fuselage, bored in at wave-top height. Zeros from the combat air patrolled up on them. One after another, the Devastators exploded or cartwheeled into the Pacific. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron died in his cockpit. Within 10 minutes, 14 of 15 TBD Devastators were destroyed. Not one torpedo hit. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor, clung to a rubber seat cushion and watched the battle from the water. At 0940, 14 Devastators from Enterprise's Torpedo Squadron 6 appeared. They attacked without coordination, approaching from a different angle than Hornet Squadron. Zeros and anti-aircraft fire shredded them. 10 were shot down. No hits. At 1000, 12 Devastators from Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3 attacked. The Zeros, now low on altitude and airspeed from destroying the previous attacks, had less time to react. But Japanese anti-aircraft fire compensated. 10 of 12 Devastators went down. Still no hits. The American torpedo attacks achieved zero material damage but had catastrophic tactical effects that no doctrine had anticipated and no training had addressed. The attacks forced the Kido Butai to maneuver violently for 90 minutes, precious minutes when Nagumo needed his carriers steaming steady on course, launching aircraft, sending his strike force toward the American carriers before those carriers could strike him. Instead, carriers turned hard, heeling over in emergency turns that rolled the flight decks at angles that made launching impossible. They accelerated to emergency speeds, forcing black smoke from their stacks as boilers received maximum fuel flow and turbines screamed at redline RPM. They zigzagged to avoid torpedoes, real and imagined, that seemed to materialize from every approach vector. This constant violent maneuvering disrupted aircraft spotting. Planes carefully positioned for launch shifted, their wheel chock slipping, wings clipping other aircraft. Ordnance men working on deck dove for cover as aircraft rolled toward them. The precise choreography required for coordinated launch devolved into desperate improvisation. More critically, the Zeros of the Combat Air Patrol descended to sea level to destroy the torpedo bombers. 48 Zeros, organized into 316 aircraft sections, dove from their 5,000-foot patrol altitude to wave-top level. They destroyed Devastator after Devastator, their 20mm cannon and 7.7mm machine guns, shredding the obsolete American torpedo bombers with contemptuous ease. But dogfighting at sea level consumed fuel at rates far exceeding high-altitude patrol. The Zero's Nakajima Sakai engines, running at combat power settings, gulped fuel. Maneuvering high G-turns to position behind targets, hard pulls to avoid return fire, consumed fuel even faster. By 10:20, when Nagumo intended to launch his strike, Japanese fighters were at low altitude, low on fuel, some critically low on ammunition after expending most of their 20mm cannon rounds destroying torpedo bombers. They needed recovery and rearming. The Combat Air Patrol had done its job perfectly, not one torpedo had hit. But that perfect defense left the sky above undefended at the moment American dive bombers arrived. The delay measured 4 minutes. But those 4 minutes meant that at 10:22, when 33 SBD dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise rolled into their attack dives, the Kido Butai's fighters were at sea level and the carrier's decks were crowded with fully fueled, fully armed strike aircraft. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led the Enterprise dive bombers. He had launched 2 hours earlier, flown to the last known Kido Butai position, found nothing, and gambled on flying northwest. At 1005, he spotted a Japanese destroyer's wake. Following that wake led him to the carriers. At 10:20 from 14,000 feet, McCluskey saw all 4 Japanese carriers below, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu arranged in a rough box formation. He split his force. One squadron would attack Kaga. McCluskey would personally lead the attack on Akagi. At 10:22, the first SBD rolled into its dive. The angle reached 70 degrees, steep enough that the horizon vanished and the carrier grew from toy to giant in the bomb sight. The SBD's split-wing dive brakes kept airspeed at 250 knots, slow enough for accurate bombing, but fast enough that anti-aircraft gunners could not track effectively. At 1,500 feet, the pilot pressed the release button. A 1,000-pound bomb fell away. On Akagi's bridge, Nagumo and his staff saw the dive bombers only seconds before impact. There was no time to maneuver. Anti-aircraft guns swung to track targets diving from directly overhead, a nearly impossible geometry. The first bomb missed Akagi by 50 feet. The second missed by 100 feet. The third struck the flight deck amidships, penetrating into the hangar where armed and fueled aircraft were parked. The bomb detonated among torpedo-armed Kates. Fuel ignited. Torpedoes cooked off. A secondary explosion ripped through the hangar, consuming aircraft-packed wingtip to wingtip. Fire spread with horrific speed, feeding on aviation gasoline, oil, ordnance wood, fabric, aluminum, flesh. A fourth bomb struck near the stern, blasting the aft elevator into the air. A fifth bomb hit the forward deck edge, its explosion flinging burning aircraft into the sea. In 120 seconds, Akagi transformed from an operational warship into a burning wreck. Simultaneously, dive bombers from Enterprise struck Kaga. 4 bombs hit. One exploded on the forward flight deck. The others penetrated to the hangar. Kaga's hangar configuration placed fuel lines and bomb storage in the most vulnerable locations. The explosions severed fuel lines, spraying pressurized aviation, gasoline across the hangar deck. Bombs and torpedoes detonated. Fire consumed everything combustible. Within 5 minutes, flames reached the bridge, forcing Kaga's captain to abandon his post. 17 SBD Dauntless from Yorktown attacked Soryu. 3 bombs hit. One struck the flight deck forward of the island, penetrating to the hangar. The second hit amidships, detonating among rearmed aircraft. The third exploded in the aft hangar. Soryu had the most volatile situation of the 3 carriers. Her hangar deck held not only aircraft, but also dozens of 800-kilogram bombs sitting unprotected during the hurried rearming process. These bombs detonated in sequence, each explosion triggering others. Soryu's hangar became a blast furnace. The carrier's thin hull plating, designed to save weight for additional aircraft capacity, could not contain the internal pressures. Bulkheads buckled. The flight deck rippled. Fire erupted from every opening. The attack lasted 6 minutes. At 10:28, the last American dive bomber pulled out and turned east. 3 Japanese carriers were burning. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu retained propulsion and still cut through the water at high speed. But fires below decks made them uninhabitable. Damage control parties fought the flames with hoses and chemical suppressants, but the fires possessed too much fuel. Hydraulic lines, pierced by shrapnel, sprayed flammable fluid. Paint blistered and ignited. Ammunition cooked off in random detonations. Aircraft ordnance, bombs, torpedoes, 20mm cannon shells exploded at unpredictable intervals, killing damage control crews and starting new fires. Hiryu remained untouched. She had steamed several miles north of the other 3 carriers, far enough to be missed by the American dive bombers. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi, commanding from Hiryu's bridge, received reports of the attacks. He understood immediately that the battle's outcome now depended entirely on his single carrier. Yamaguchi was Japan's most aggressive carrier admiral, a commander who believed speed mattered more than caution. At 10:40, even before fully assessing the damage to the other carriers, Yamaguchi ordered a strike launched. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zeros toward the American carriers. The strike group possessed nothing like the overwhelming power that Kido Butai doctrine prescribed. Conventional planning called for 80 to 100 aircraft, but Yamaguchi understood that hesitation meant death. At 1200, Kobayashi found Yorktown. American fighters intercepted, shooting down several Vals before they could attack. But 8 dive bombers reached release point. 3 bombs hit Yorktown, one puncturing the flight deck and exploding deep in the ship, 2 others hitting near the island. The carrier shuddered to a halt, power lost, fires spreading. At 13:31, Hiryu launched a second strike. Lieutenant Tamanaga personally led 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros. Tamanaga flew a damaged aircraft. His Kate had taken anti-aircraft hits during the morning Midway strike, rupturing the port fuel tank. The aircraft leaked gasoline continuously. Tominaga knew he lacked fuel to return. He was flying a suicide mission, and he flew it willingly because Hiryu had no other strike leader available. At 14:30, Tominaga's Kates found Yorktown. American combat air patrol destroyed 3 Kates immediately, but the remaining 7 pressed their attacks. Tominaga's aircraft, trailing white vapor from its ruptured fuel tank, bored in from the starboard side. At 500 yards, Tominaga released his torpedo. Seconds later, a 5-inch anti-aircraft shell detonated next to his Kate. The aircraft exploded, slamming into the ocean in a cascade of burning fuel and shredded aluminum. His torpedo ran true. It struck Yorktown's hull, amidships, tearing a 30-foot hole below the waterline. 2 other torpedoes hit. Yorktown lost all power. The list increased to 26 degrees. At 1500, Yorktown's captain ordered abandoned ship. Tominaga's sacrifice seemed to balance the scales. Americans had destroyed 3 Japanese carriers, but Hiryu's strikes had eliminated Yorktown. 1 Japanese carrier remained operational against 2 American carriers. But the Americans knew where Hiryu was. The returning strike aircraft had been tracked back to their source. At 15:30, 24 SBD, Dauntless from Enterprise attacked Hiryu. 4 bombs hit. The first struck forward, penetrating to the hangar. The second and third hit amidships, 20 feet apart, detonating among aircraft being rearmed for a third strike. The 4th bomb exploded near the island, wrecking the bridge and communications center. Hiryu's hangar deck repeated Akagi's nightmare. Fuel ignited, ordnance exploded, fire spread faster than damage control could counter. By 16:30, Hiryu's flight deck glowed red-hot from fires burning below. At 1,700, magazine explosions ripped through the forward section. The carrier's bow began settling into the water. Darkness brought temporary respite, but no salvation. On Akagi, Admiral Nagumo transferred his flag to the light cruiser Nagara at 1800 hours. The carrier that had carried Nagumo's flag to Pearl Harbor, Darwin, Ceylon, and Midway was dying. Fires had spread beyond control. The engineering spaces, though still functional, could not be reached through the flames. At 0200 on June 5th, destroyers fired torpedoes into Akagi's hull. She sank at 0450, taking 267 men with her. Kaga lasted until 1925 on June 4th. Explosions racked her hull throughout the afternoon. The fires burned so intensely that steel plating softened and warped. At 1920, a final massive explosion, probably the forward aviation gasoline tanks detonating, tore through the ship. Kaga rolled onto her port side and sank stern first, her propellers still slowly turning as she vanished. 811 men died with the ship. Soryu sank first at 1913 on June 4th. She burned for 7 hours, internal explosions steadily weakening her hull. Shortly after 1900, the keel broke. Soryu split in half and went down in minutes. 718 men perished. Hiryu drifted through the night as a burning wreck. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi refused evacuation, choosing to remain with his ship. At 0230 on June 5th, he assembled the remaining crew on the darkened deck. He apologized for losing the carrier. Then he ordered evacuation. At 0510, destroyers fired torpedoes into Hiryu's hull. She sank at 0912, taking Yamaguchi and 416 men into 17,000 feet of water. Admiral Yamamoto, commanding the combined fleet from Yamato's bridge 300 miles behind the carrier force, received reports throughout June 4th. Each message brought worse news. 3 carriers burning. 4 carriers burning. American carriers still operational. By midnight, Yamamoto understood that Operation MI had failed catastrophically. The American carriers could not be destroyed because the Kido Butai no longer existed. At 0255 on June 5th, Yamamoto transmitted the order, "Occupation of Midway is canceled. The combined fleet will withdraw." The statistics documented a historically unprecedented naval disaster, losses that could be quantified but whose strategic consequences defied simple numerical analysis. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, representing 40% of its frontline carrier force. The heavy cruiser Mikuma, sunk 2 days after the carrier battle, added another capital ship to the butcher's bill. 248 carrier aircraft, Zeros, Kates, Vals went down with the ships or were destroyed in combat, representing roughly 30% of the IJN's carrier-qualified aircraft. 3,057 men died, including 110 irreplaceable pilots and hundreds of specialized maintenance personnel whose skills required years to develop. The United States lost 1 carrier, Yorktown, sunk by submarine I-168 on June 7 while under tow. The destroyer Hammond, providing power and pumping assistance to Yorktown, was torpedoed and sunk by the same submarine attack. 145 aircraft were lost to combat, anti-aircraft fire, and operational accidents. 307 men died, losses that American training establishments could replace within months. But numbers alone inadequately measured the defeat's magnitude or its cascading consequences for Japanese naval strategy. Japan had possessed 10 fleet and light carriers when war began in December 1941. Those 10 carriers represented the accumulation of 20 years of carrier aviation development, billions of yen in construction costs, and the distillation of tactical doctrine into steel and aircraft. 4 of those carriers were now at the bottom of the Pacific, their hulls shattered, their hangar decks collapsed, their aircraft crushed beneath thousands of tons of seawater. The light carrier Shoho had been sunk at Coral Sea in May. 5 carriers remained operational, the fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku in home waters undergoing repairs and aircrew replacement. The light carriers Zuho, Hasho, and Ryujo scattered across the Pacific in support roles. None could match the striking power of the lost fleet carriers. The others were scattered across the empire, supporting operations in the Aleutians, New Guinea, and the Solomons, dispersed rather than concentrated, reactive rather than offensive, defending rather than attacking. The Kido Butai, as a concentrated striking force, ceased to exist. Japanese naval strategy, built around carrier-based decisive battle delivered by concentrated air power against divided enemies, lost its primary instrument. The doctrine remained. The means to execute it vanished beneath the Pacific on June 4th. More devastating than hulls was the human loss. 3,000 men included hundreds of irreplaceable personnel, aircraft mechanics who understood the Zero's temperamental Sake engine, ordnance men who could arm torpedoes in darkness and rough seas, flight deck directors who choreographed the complex ballet of launching and recovering aircraft. Most critically, 110 pilots died. These were men who had spent 5 years learning carrier aviation, who had struck Pearl Harbor, Darwin, Ceylon. Japan's training system could replace them only by reducing training standards, which meant future pilots would be less skilled, which meant higher attrition rates, which meant even less skilled replacements. Midway initiated a death spiral in pilot quality that Japan never reversed. American cryptographic success and Japanese communication rigidity created the conditions for disaster. Commander Rockefeller's code-breaking gave Admiral Nimitz strategic surprise. The American carriers were positioned northeast of Midway before Nagumo even knew they had left Pearl Harbor. Yet Japanese communication doctrine prevented this intelligence from reaching Nagumo. Yamamoto maintained strict radio silence to avoid detection. When Tone Scout reported the American carriers, Yamamoto's staff debated transmitting this critical information to Nagumo. They decided against it, fearing radio transmissions would reveal Yamato's position. Nagumo fought the Battle of Midway without knowing that American codebreakers had compromised Japanese naval communications, without knowing that 3 American carriers awaited him, without knowing that his plan's fundamental assumptions were invalid. The concentrated carrier formation, Japan's greatest tactical strength, became a lethal vulnerability. Massing 4 carriers within a few miles provided overwhelming striking power, but also presented a concentrated target. When American dive bombers found the formation, they could attack multiple carriers simultaneously. Had the carriers been dispersed, say, 50 miles apart, American aircraft from Midway, and the carriers would have found only 1 or 2 Japanese carriers. The others would have survived to counterattack. But dispersion violated doctrine. Kantai Kessen required concentration. The rearming decision reflected another doctrinal rigidity. Nagumo faced contradictory missions: suppress Midway and maintain readiness against enemy carriers. Japanese doctrine, developed through years of exercises, assumed these missions would be sequential, not simultaneous. Exercises had never tested the carrier force against a scenario where land-based air attacks and carrier-based attacks occurred concurrently. When that scenario materialized at Midway, Nagumo had no doctrinal framework for response. He defaulted to the principle that had always succeeded: coordinated mass strikes. This principle required rearming the entire reserve rather than launching partial attacks. The decision was defensible by doctrine. It was lethal in reality. The torpedo bomber sacrifice demonstrated a stark contrast in American and Japanese aerial doctrine. American torpedo squadrons attacked without fighter escort, without coordination with dive bombers, against overwhelming fighter opposition. All three squadrons were annihilated. Yet these sacrificial attacks drew Japanese combat air patrol to sea level, leaving the high altitude undefended when dive bombers arrived. The Americans, whether through planning or accident, achieved vertical coordination: torpedo bombers at low altitude, dive bombers at high altitude, both arriving within minutes of each other. Japanese doctrine never anticipated this tactic. Combat air patrols focused on the immediate threat, leaving the sky above unguarded. 4 Japanese carriers rested on the Pacific floor because 6 minutes of dive bomber attacks found them with flight decks crowded by fueled and armed aircraft. Had the American dive bombers arrived 15 minutes earlier, they would have found empty decks. Tomonaga's Midway strike force was still landing. Had they arrived 15 minutes later, the Japanese strike force would have launched. Either timing would have allowed the carriers to survive, maneuver, and counterattack. But Wade McCluskey's navigation error, flying past the Kido Butai's expected position, searching northwest, finding nothing until a destroyer's wake provided a clue, delayed his arrival to the precise moment of maximum Japanese vulnerability. Fortune favors the prepared, but at Midway, fortune's margin measured in minutes. In the battle's aftermath, Japanese survivors struggled to comprehend what occurred. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, the Pearl Harbor strike leader who watched Midway from Akagi's sick bay, later wrote that the battle seemed impossible. The Kido Butai had executed its mission correctly. Tomonaga's strike had damaged Midway's defenses. The carriers had recovered the attack force efficiently. Rearming proceeded on schedule. Then, in 6 minutes, everything ended. Fukuda's post-war account contained factual errors. He misremembered timing, exaggerated rearming completion, implied the carriers were minutes from launching when dive bombers struck. These errors suggested less intentional deception than psychological inability to accept that the Kido Butai, invincible for 6 months, could be destroyed so quickly. The Japanese Navy never again possessed sufficient carriers to threaten American naval supremacy, not because Japan stopped building carriers, but because the rate of American construction transformed carrier warfare from a contest of skill into a contest of industrial output. By December 1942, only 4 Japanese fleet carriers remained operational. Shokaku and Zuikaku had survived Midway, but their air groups were depleted of experienced pilots. Junyo and Hayo, conversions from passenger ship hulls, lacked the speed and aircraft capacity of the lost fleet carriers. The United States, meanwhile, commissioned Essex-class carriers at a rate approaching 1 every 8 weeks once production reached full tempo. These ships, 872 feet long, 27,100 tons standard displacement, capable of 33 knots, and embarking 90 to 100 aircraft, emerged from American shipyards in numbers that Japanese intelligence refused to believe even when confronted with photographic evidence. By war's end in August 1945, America operated 28 fleet carriers and 71 escort carriers, a combined total of 99 operational carriers projecting air power across both the Pacific and Atlantic. This armada represented industrial capacity, operating at a scale Japan never remotely approached. Japan added 3 fleet carriers during the entire war, Taiho launched in 1943 and sunk at Philippine Sea in 1944 after a single battle. Shinano converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull and sunk by submarine 10 days after commissioning, and Unryu completed in 1944 and sunk by submarine in 1944 without ever engaging in combat. All three were lost within months of entering service. The industrial disparity that Yamamoto feared before Pearl Harbor, the nightmare that drove his argument for a short, decisive war, became reality. Midway did not guarantee American victory. American industrial capacity would eventually have produced that outcome regardless. But Midway made Japanese victory impossible. It eliminated the narrow window where Japanese skill and tactical excellence might have compensated for American material superiority. After June 4, 1942, the Pacific War became a war of attrition that only one nation could win. The defeat transformed Japanese strategic thinking from offensive to defensive. Pre-Midway, Japan planned to expand its defensive perimeter to Australia, India, Hawaii. Post-Midway, Japan focused on holding what it had already conquered. The Solomon Islands campaign, Guadalcanal in particular, became a 6-month attrition battle that drained Japanese naval aviation of its remaining experienced pilots. By 1943, when new carriers entered service, Japan lacked the trained air groups to operate them effectively. Doctrinal emphasis on elite pilots, men with 5 years of training, became a catastrophic liability when combat consumed them faster than training could replace them. Midway's operational lessons were studied intensively by Japanese naval officers, analyzed in classified reports, debated in staff colleges, and then systematically misunderstood. Japanese naval commanders fixated on tactical mistakes rather than strategic vulnerabilities. The post-battle critiques emphasized that Nagumo should have launched immediately when American carriers were first reported, accepting the risk of a partial strike rather than waiting for a coordinated attack. Scout planes should have launched on time and found the American carriers earlier, providing the warning time that doctrine assumed. Combat air patrol should have maintained high-altitude coverage rather than descending to sea level to destroy torpedo bombers. Surface screening forces should have been positioned to provide better anti-aircraft support. The air groups should have been rearmed faster. The damage control parties should have contained fires more effectively. These critiques, while technically accurate, missed the systemic problem that no tactical adjustment could solve. Kantai-Kessen doctrine assumed Japanese initiative, Japanese surprise, and Japanese concentrated striking power delivered against divided American forces. The doctrine assumed that reconnaissance would provide complete intelligence before battle. It assumed that coordination would proceed according to plan. It assumed that the enemy would react predictably. When Americans achieved surprise at Midway, when American code-breaking revealed Japanese intentions, when American carriers positioned themselves in ambush, when American attacks disrupted Japanese coordination, the doctrine collapsed. Every tactic, every procedure, every training evolution was optimized for offensive operations where Japan chose the time and place of battle. None addressed defensive scenarios where the enemy struck first, struck unexpectedly, and struck with coordination that violated Japanese assumptions about American capabilities. Japan never developed an alternative doctrine. The decisive battle concept remained official strategy until war's end. Subsequent carrier battles, Eastern Solomons in August 1942, Santa Cruz in October 1942, Philippine Sea in June 1944, Leyte Gulf in October 1944 repeated Midway's pattern with variations that changed details but not outcomes. Japanese carriers sought decisive battle. They found instead American surprise, American numerical superiority, American intelligence advantages provided by code-breaking and radar, and American industrial replacement capacity that made attrition a losing strategy regardless of tactical results. At Philippine Sea, Japan lost 3 carriers and 600 aircraft in an engagement American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. At Leyte Gulf, for carriers served as decoys, bait to lure American carriers north while battleships attempted a surface attack on the invasion fleet. The carriers were sunk as planned. The battleship attack failed. the decisive battle doctrine, conceived in the shadow of Tsushima and validated at Pearl Harbor, died slowly across 2 more years of defeats that Midway made inevitable. The human dimension lingered longest, haunting survivors for decades and shaping Japan's collective memory of the Pacific War. Survivors carried Midway's trauma in ways that physical wounds never fully captured. The men who escaped the burning carriers, pulled from the water by destroyers, their clothing singed, their skin blistered, their lungs scorched by superheated air, bore visible injuries that eventually healed. The psychological wounds never did. Japanese veterans rarely spoke publicly about the battle, not merely because of military classification, but because cultural shame attached to defeat, especially defeat so sudden and complete. Japan's martial culture emphasized victory through spirit, discipline, and sacrifice. Defeat suggested insufficient spirit, inadequate discipline, unworthy sacrifice. The men who survived 4 carriers sinking bore collective guilt for losses they could not have prevented. Captain Mitsuo Fukuda, the Pearl Harbor strike leader who watched Midway from Akagi's sick bay while recovering from appendicitis, became a Christian missionary after the war. He traveled America speaking about Pearl Harbor, describing the attack with technical precision and historical perspective. He rarely spoke about Midway. When pressed, he described the battle as impossible, a word that captured his inability to reconcile the Kido Butai's destruction with his understanding of Japanese carrier doctrine. Fukuda's post-war writings about Midway contain factual errors that suggested not deliberate revision, but genuine confusion about what happened that morning when invincibility dissolved into flame. Survivors of the 4 carriers scattered across post-war Japan, returning to civilian life in a nation rebuilding from atomic devastation and military occupation. They became salarymen, teachers, factory workers, farmers, men whose wartime service was known to family, but rarely discussed in public. Yet their shared experience bound them in ways family could never understand. They had witnessed the empire's high-water mark, 6 months of unbroken victory, conquest stretching across 1/7 of the Earth's surface, the promise that Japanese martial spirit could overcome material disadvantage. And they had witnessed that promises collapse within a single day, burned away in 6 minutes of dive bombing that revealed all assumptions as illusions. The survivors held occasional reunions, gathering to remember shipmates who never came home, to honor ships that lay in darkness at the Pacific's bottom, and to contemplate the battle that changed everything. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga left no personal account, no memoir, no letters explaining his final mission's calculations. He died in his torpedo bomber's cockpit at 14:30 on June 4th, his aircraft exploding in a fireball of aviation fuel and seawater as his torpedo ran toward Yorktown's hull. Tominaga knew his fuel tank was ruptured from morning anti-aircraft damage over Midway. He knew the leak was continuous and irreparable. He knew he lacked fuel to return to Hiryu, even if the strike succeeded. He flew anyway, because Hiryu had no other qualified strike leader available, and because Japanese naval culture demanded that officers lead from the most dangerous position regardless of personal cost. His wingmen watched him die, saw the Kate disintegrate under American fire, noted his torpedoes track running true toward the target. His death exemplified the nobility and futility that characterized Japan's Pacific War, individual sacrifice of extraordinary caliber, courage beyond question, tactical skill of the highest order, all directed toward strategic objectives that industrial reality made unachievable. Tominaga's sacrifice damaged 1 American carrier. It could not change the battle's outcome. It could not reverse Japan's strategic situation. It could not resurrect the 4 Japanese carriers already burning or sunk. His death, like the deaths of 3,000 others at Midway, demonstrated that valor alone cannot overcome industrial capacity, that fighting spirit cannot substitute for strategic planning, and that doctrine divorced from reality produces only futile sacrifice. The 4 carriers rest in 17,000 feet of water, their hulls broken and scattered across the Pacific floor. In 2019, research vessel Petrel located Akagi's wreckage, Her distinctive portside island still identifiable, her flight deck collapsed into the hangar, her hull covered in anemones and deep-sea corals. Kaga was found the same year, sitting upright on the bottom, her forward flight deck gun mounts still visible. The wrecks serve as graves for the 2,500 men who went down with the ships. They also serve as monuments to a doctrine that assumed decisive battle would determine the war's outcome, a doctrine proven lethally wrong one June morning when American dive bombers rolled into attack and 4 Japanese carriers burned. Admiral Yamamoto survived Midway by 1 year. On April 18, 1943, American P-38 Lightning fighters intercepted his transport aircraft over Bougainville and shot it down. Yamamoto's death removed the last senior Japanese officer who understood that Japan could not defeat American industrial power. The war continued for 2 more years, consuming millions of lives, ending only with atomic bombs and Soviet invasion. Yet the war's decisive turning point occurred at Midway, when Japan's offensive capability died in 6 minutes of dive bombing. The Battle of Midway demonstrated that modern naval warfare permitted no errors. A single reconnaissance aircraft launching 30 minutes late, Tone's search plane that spotted the American carriers belatedly altered the entire battle. A navigation mistake by one American squadron leader, Wade McCluskey, flying past the Japanese position, then gambling on a northwest search, positioned dive bombers at the exact moment of maximum Japanese vulnerability. These contingencies multiplied across hundreds of decisions made by tired men operating on incomplete information determined the outcome. Japan entered the battle expecting to replicate Pearl Harbor's success. Instead, Japan experienced Pearl Harbor's horror from the receiving end, overwhelming air attack against ships unable to defend themselves, disaster arriving faster than comprehension, a fleet reduced to burning wrecks. Within minutes, the first air fleet sortied from Japan on May 27, 1942, as the most powerful carrier force ever assembled. It returned on June 13th as 4 carriers, 7 cruisers, and 12 destroyers, every carrier missing, most pilots dead, the doctrine that guided the Imperial Japanese Navy proven obsolete by circumstance and the enemy's evolution. Japanese naval aviation never recovered. The Kido Butai's destruction at Midway marked not just a battle lost, but a strategy invalidated, a doctrine shattered, an empire's offensive capability eliminated in 6 minutes between 10:22 and 10:28 on June 4, 1942. When American dive bombers rolled in from 14,000 feet and 4 Japanese carriers exploded into flame. If this story gave you a new way to see the Pacific War, share and subscribe, and tell us which moment surprised you most. We'll return next week with another chapter in the war that changed the world.